I hope, yes, that is now working. So, Ronald, the floor is yours.
Wow, well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming. It's delightful to be here. I'm actually, this is probably the first community of, well, it's not the first community of anthropologists that I'm presenting this material to, but it's pretty close. So I'm really curious to see your response. So once we get the PowerPoint up, we can.
It's coming now.
It's coming now.
Slowly.
Slowly, okay. This book is this talk is based partly on the book #Human Rights, and I'll go over some of the main arguments that I have there. But also, I want to show how I'm moving beyond the main findings. Oh, great. Okay, so we see this now. Can we have the next slide, please, David? So, as part of the background to #Human Rights, I'm thinking about communications technologies and their social impacts. And we have basically two schools of theorization about the impact of communications revolutions. We have one that's based in Canada at the University of Toronto, with the most famous of these contributors being Marshall McLuhan. But we also have the sort of British group, the social anthropology group and the social history group, of which Professor Jack Goody, my doctoral supervisor, is probably the best known for his work. Next slide, please. His work that started with his collaboration with the classicist Ian Watt. And there was this idea that sort of resounded in the discipline that had to do with how the technologies of communication. Goody started with alphabetic literacy, and then he discussed the printing press, and he had to theorize about the problem of restricted literacy and what prevents a leap in social imagination and technological and critical revolutions. So he's looking at the idea of a critical revolution that follows from the simple technology of the permanence of writing in his early work. Next slide, please. So in #Human Rights, and no, your eyes there's nothing wrong with it, and there's nothing wrong with the slide itself. This is what the cover looks like, and it sort of represents the descent into confusion and obscurity that follows from digital technologies and human rights. Next slide, please. And so in thinking about the connection to law and technology, limiting myself to this idea of human rights and the human rights revolution as a central part of the consciousness that followed from new technologies since World War II, I'm looking at 3 eras of human rights. And again, with reference back to the idea of there being a core element of consequences of the technologies for the way that people's social behavior works, and the way that it shapes the repertoire that people have for, in this case, human rights activism. So immediately after World War II, we're looking at something that I refer to as analog activism, where people are communicating by telephone, they're organizing in the streets. I look at in hashtag human rights, I'm using the example of the Klarsfeld Serge and Beate Klarsfeld, based in Germany, and their effort to go after war criminals. And this was the central focus of human rights consciousness and public consciousness in the immediate post-World War II era. Skipping ahead to when we have the internet working, and this is in fact when I'm starting to look at this phenomenon. The netizen activism, people who are connected by tech-savvy intermediaries who help them to get out the claims and causes that are dear to their hearts. The most famous of these would be the Chiapas Rebellion, in which Subcomandante Marcos was known to have a very important internet presence through the 1990s. Human Rights 3.0, I argue, arrives with a constellation of new technologies around 2005 to 2008. In this very short window, we have the release of the first smartphone. We have the arrival onto the scene of the first social media platforms. We have with Facebook above all making its presence felt. We have on the other hand also an increase in both the technologies and social acceptance of surveillance by states. So we have new capacities for human rights violations happening at the same time. And so these come together to create, I argue, a completely new approach to justice claims and causes by people who are acting on behalf of those causes. So expressing a grievance, their critical capacities to resist both the governments that are violating international law and other organizations that are violating laws. Let's go to the next slide. So here we have the 2016 meeting of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and I'm sitting in the back looking down at the Indigenous people who are relegated to a balcony, and I'm astonished to see all of the screens and the navigation and the connection.
Okay, love you. Bye. Bye.
Sorry, we have somebody whose voice is coming on. Thank you.
I think you might have your mic on, Brian.
Okay. So we have these people who are connecting to outside audiences, but they're connecting to information. This is all familiar to us. They're connecting on social media. They're forming Facebook groups and so on. And I want to talk about this aspect of Human Rights 3.0. Next slide. If you click on that, then we might get through some of the images that I have. There we go. So these are a number of images from the annual meeting of the Tuareg diaspora in a small farming village outside of Évreux, France. And here we have people who've left. Many of them have left, and some quite recently, and some on boats have left Mali and Niger to cross through Italy and find their way to France. And they're forming activist groups, and they're connecting with people back home, and they're very interested in networking and lobbying and defending their interests, both as immigrants, but defending their interests back home as well. They are struggling against armed insurgencies in the north of their countries. including those by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And this is the group with whom I'm now working with in order to create something else, another kind of possibility that is opened up for them, in addition to their networking and their formation of community groups. And that is a capacity for digital witnessing that didn't used to exist before. So you notice from the various images that came with this slide, the presence of smartphones, multi-sensored tools that can record video and stills and sounds. So a lot of these people, almost everybody who's adult and some who aren't, have these devices available and have the capacity to immediately load whatever it is that they're filming to the internet or to some other more private platform like WhatsApp. So I'm a member of a WhatsApp group with this community, and sometimes I see images that I'd rather not, right? And WhatsApp is slow to take these down. So content moderation has gone through a history, it's changed, and it varies according to the platforms. But this is an important component, an important part of the phenomenon of what is sometimes referred to as open source intelligence or open source investigations. And it's important to the specific aspect of this that I want to talk about at greater length, which is digital archiving for both the formation of community, which is, of course, near and dear to our hearts as anthropologists, and for the pursuit of justice claims in international criminal law. Next slide. And next. So the archiving, what is digital archiving? So here we have Barrister Amal Clooney, married to the famous George Clooney. So she has a high profile, both as a lawyer and as a celebrity. And she is working with the Yazidi population who experienced a genocide through the occupation by ISIS in northern Iraq. And she is in part, next slide, involved in the phenomenon that I'm looking at here, the collection and preservation of documentary evidence, including photographic and video materials published online. So why and how are they doing this? This is what I want to talk about a little bit more. So a number of organizations, not just Yazda. Let's go to the next slide. We have a number of organizations that are, and not so organized groups that are collecting this kind of documentary evidence and putting it into archives in the pursuit of a justice claim. What I have here is a slide that was an image that was created by amateur investigators after the January 6th occupation of the Capitol building. One of these amateur investigators managed to hack the platform Parler, where a lot of the insurgents and right-wing insurgents and white supremacists were communicating, planning, organizing, expressing their opinions, posting pictures, and so on. And they got huge amounts of data from Parler, including metadata, including the location of the people who formed their accounts, and including their credit card information, which I don't think they did anything with. But they got so much material from this platform, from this right-wing platform, that they were able to create a heat map of the membership, which we have represented in this image here. Next slide. And furthermore, what they were able to do is they were able to link images from the Parler platform with images from that were taken and posted online from the January 6th rebellion. They had access to a facial recognition software known as Clearview, and they were able to make at least preliminary connections, tracing people both by what they posted and said on the platform, and their images that were then that matched. This information was sent en masse to the FBI. And the effect of the crowdsourcing this kind of project, and the enthusiasm that went behind it too, the energy that went behind it, had this kind of amateur investigation producing, for a time, many more results and identifications than the FBI was able to do. So the policing effort after the January 6th was in part pushed ahead by amateur investigators using basically the kind of digital archiving and investigation that I'm talking about. Next slide. Perhaps one of the most important projects of this kind is Syrian Archive, which is one of 3 archiving projects that are under the parent organization Mnemonic. There's Syrian Archive, Yemeni Archive, and Sudan Archive. Syrian Archive is the first and by far the largest. They have close to 4 million items in the archive, about 6,000 of which have been authenticated. That means having an additional process of investigation, authentication, verification, connection to linkage data that will make the video connected to the setting that's depicted. So looking at the metadata on the video, the timestamp when it was taken, where, geolocation, to things that appear in the video, the buildings that allow the video to be geolocated, shadows that will give you an idea of the time, even a patch on somebody's uniform that'll give you an idea of what country and where the movements of the military were taking place. So Syrian Archive is, thank you for this, in using this kind of material to investigate the war crimes that are being committed by the government of Syria under Assad and its ally Russia. And this includes the bombing of hospitals, several important chemical attacks that are well documented on civilian populations. And this effort, it's important to note, occurs in conditions of impunity. So they're amassing all of this video evidence, but Russia holds a seat with veto power on the Security Council, and none of the efforts to pursue war crimes investigations have come to anything. So it exists, this kind of documentation is happening under circumstances of impunity in international law. Next slide, please. Impunity in international law, but not complete impunity, because there is in some of the European countries a recognition of universal jurisdiction, which means that if any individual is found who has committed a war crime, and there's a plausible reason to think they have, and enough evidence exists for an indictment and a prosecution, that can then happen. This is precisely what has happened in Germany on a number of occasions, with a case ongoing. So the Office of the German Federal Public Prosecutor is looking at a number of complaints, and those include complaints involving the attacks with sarin gas on Guta and Han Shaikun. The prosecution of these kinds of war crimes is also extended to corporations. There were, I think, a couple of years ago, 2 Belgian corporations that were found to have exported sarin gas illegally against embargoes to Syria. And executives were sentenced to several years for this, and the corporations were subject to such heavy penalties that they had to declare bankruptcy and cease to exist, a phenomenon that's sometimes referred to unpleasantly as the corporate death penalty or corporate capital punishment. Next slide, please. So, looking at this as a social phenomenon, here I'm sort of in the beginning of thinking about this. But one of the places to, I think, look closely is the division between witnesses and analysts. So the witnesses I showed you in a previous slide, they're the kinds of people that were attending the meeting of the Tuareg diaspora in France. Many of them are ordinary people, but some are actually practiced at witnessing. They know where to go to take the images. There are intermediaries between witnesses and analysts, and also, I should probably add, journalists. So there is in Syrian archive an established network of several hundred practiced witnesses who are able to take videos, know how to take the videos, and have channels through which to bring those videos to analysts and journalists, and to do that safely. So it isn't always possible, of course, to upload. Sometimes they're smuggled out of the country on a flash drive, which is very dangerous. They have so they have established networks between witnesses and analysts. But there is also a divide, I think, between ordinary witnesses who aren't practiced or experienced and the analysts who are looking at the digital data, who have their own sort of specialist communities that are linked more to prosecutors than anything else, and journalists, of course. So let's look at this a little bit more. Next slide. One of the ways that the witness and analyst divide breaks down is when the analysts take to the streets. And during the Portland riots of last summer, we saw, or at least many of us did, saw a good example of this with the work of Robert Evans, who's a member of the open source investigation collective, Bellingcat. So Robert Evans, who's also an analyst who writes stories based on open source investigations, was in the streets. And you can see that from the video here, what you have is somebody's cell phone taking pictures of the police violence, and it's linked to a cable, to a power cable. So they're going around, they're in the street with a battery and a power cable so that they can stay there the whole night and take images of whatever is happening and then edit it later. So this is a professional witness, and somebody who knows how to manipulate, to look at the data, to authenticate it, to make sure it's reliable. Next slide. And we also have with this phenomena the idea that witnesses can offer their testimony in a way that lends credibility to what they're saying. So this is something that I recognize is important because of work that I did in truth commissions. And in truth commissions, particularly of late, there's great emphasis on victim centrism and on the victim statement or survivor statement. But often the survivor statement is doubted. It's seen as being interested. What we have in this kind of witnessing are survivor statements that are accompanied by visual digital data. So Syrian archives efforts are also lending credence, lending a new kind of voice to people who are talking about their lives under conditions of mass violence. So here we have, I chose this as a still because we have somebody who's pointing to something that, as anthropologists, I'm sure we would see as being understandable and ordinary and quotidian. It was an area that was planted with eggplant. And you look at the desperation in his eyes, that area that was planted with eggplant was something that was hugely important. It was a source of subsistence in an area where there's food insecurity. So when the bomb lands on it, when the rubble wipes it all out, suddenly they're faced with a serious and desperate problem. And so this kind of testimony is something that Syrian archive is gathering too, and it creates conditions for a different kind of post-violence witnessing. This is, of course, not post-violence. It's happening during the bombing, during the violence, during the repression. But it what it does is offers a new kind of testimony in the kind of phenomenon that we're looking at in transitional justice. Next slide, please. So authentication. Here I have a picture of my fridge magnet, which has a picture of Lincoln and says the trouble with quotes on the internet is that you never know if they're genuine, right? So what this is telling us, of course, it's a humorous take on the idea that you can't believe anything on the internet. And this is where digital archiving is coming up against some significant issues, because the archiving efforts have to confront state efforts at misinformation and distraction, denial, and they're very, very good at it. It has been had a major impact on our knowledge environment. And the knowledge environment is a significant part of where knowledge, including collective knowledge and identity, comes from. So this confusion of the knowledge environment by what I'm referring to as criminal states is a significant part of the phenomenon that I'm looking at. Russia in particular has perfected the idea of misinformation, not to place a believable denial, but to put enough doubt and confusion out into the media ecosystem that nobody believes anything, and that there's nothing that is trusted, and that everything can be denied, and that everything feeds into the possibility of a conspiracy, that there is no secure knowledge. And when there's no secure knowledge, even the careful efforts that are made to document and video record crimes as they occur can be thrown into doubt. So how do open source investigators deal with this? Next slide, please. I'll move along more quickly now. So they have, of course, deep fakes. We're familiar with that. One of the most important being Obama's speech that was created out of nothing. Next slide. So we have the Bellingcat toolkit. Bellingcat is an organization based in both Leicester and in the Netherlands. It has NGO status in the Netherlands. And this is the whole panoply of tools, online tools, that it's using to engage in the investigations that are usually based upon video evidence. So we have the whole range of social media platforms. We have marine traffic trackers. We have air traffic trackers. We have search engines. We have tools for reverse image searching to see where an image has turned up on the internet before, on and on and on. And it's something that you can contribute to if you see that there's another platform out there that might be useful. Next slide, please. So this was a part of my ethnography. I undertook a Bellingcat training. I wasn't allowed to take pictures of anyone, so I give you a delightful picture of the floor with all of the power cables. It was a very interesting and serious undertaking in Amsterdam that took a week. I did another training course of the same sort in Berkeley, which was more oriented towards the legal dimension of these kinds of investigations. Next slide, please. And so we have this effort to deal with fakes. Let's go quickly through a fake that occurred a number of years ago, now 5 years ago, with a bombing, car bomb that occurred in Baghdad. And I'll use this example quickly. So we have a bombing. Go quickly through the slides. Next one. We have a CCTV camera that's there, and it's taking these images. Car parked, the man walks away, it blows up, these people come in, they lie on the ground, the medics arrive, and lo and behold, we have a news story that makes it onto the global wire. It was only several years later that Christiaan Triebert, who now works for the New York Times, was then with Bellingcat, who discovered that through somebody who informed him, it was actually a fake that was set up by the Iraq Falcon intelligence cell. So even the events that we're looking at in video evidence can be part of this fakery. Next slide. Prosecution. This is the office that I visited of SITU Research, based in the Brooklyn Navy Yards, and it's an architectural firm that has taken it upon itself to use its ability to plot out spatial design, to go back to these videos and to plot out what happens during the occurrence of a mass crime. Next slide. And so they've done a number of high-profile investigations that are featured on their website. Next slide. And the one that I'm particularly concerned with and looking at a little bit more closely is their investigation of the destruction of UNESCO monuments in Timbuktu. So they sent a cameraman to Timbuktu to take pictures of the sites after destruction. And they used existing video to create a before, during, and after platform. Next slide. So they mapped out all of the different sites that were destroyed on their by Ansar ad-Din, the insurgency group. Next slide. And here we have an example of the platform with the destruction of the Vicky or Three Saints monument that has the before, during, and after. So each of these have a before, a during, and an after. And in some of the durings, we actually have the people who are giving orders and so on visible in the camera. So it was a very sort of slick, easily navigable platform that SITU research created for the International Criminal Court. And it led to, next slide, it led to Al-Hassan and a guilty plea. And in 2016, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He would have he'd be serving his sentence, not in The Hague, but in Mali at this moment. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to wrap things down, come to a conclusion soon. But we have now this kind of evidence and this kind of archival material finding its way as the basis of prosecutions in the International Criminal Court, including in the indictment of Mahmoud al-Rafali, who was accused of war crimes for killings that he himself, the Al-Saika Brigade, posted to the internet and that were then downloaded by investigators. He was killed in the civil war in Libya just a few weeks ago, so the indictment is now no longer applicable. But the ICC is looking at this idea of video evidence being the foundation for future prosecutions. Next slide. And Berkeley University, the Center for Human Rights, has come out with a protocol for prosecutors and judges to follow in their handling of digital forensic evidence. So not all judges are equally adept at using and understanding this material. I actually have a student who's working with judges in the Home Office in the UK, in which an immigration proceeding had to be stopped temporarily because one of the applicants was making use of his Instagram page to make a claim for his religious membership. And the judge had to have the proceedings stopped so that somebody could explain to him over 15 minutes what Instagram was. Now, this kind of, this isn't, of course, universal, but just by way of letting you know that judges are uneven. So they need the protocol to be assured that the evidence is reliable and that it is, that there are ways to gather the evidence as well. That are not going to endanger witnesses and that make the chain of custody of the digital evidence reliable. Next slide, please. So this is where I'm at. I made it through the doors of the International Criminal Court to the Office of the Prosecutor but once. So this is an ongoing project that builds on my book, #HumanRights. I don't know precisely what the end goal will be in terms of publications, but it's now a project that I'm committed to and will see through with the community that is now interested in this kind of work, the NGOs in West Africa, through the diaspora in Europe, who I'll be meeting with later this month to talk about possibilities of recording this kind of material and making it available in an archive. Well, not universally available, of course, but it can be viewed by those who have access to the internet. So you can see a lot of things that you'd wish you didn't see if you were to navigate Syrian archives materials that they have available. So this is another way that people are creating legal identities and forming themselves into claimant groups, but with the added sort of the added allure and solidity of digital evidence to back up their claims of victimization through crimes of the state and through the crimes of insurgent groups of the sort that we have at work in the Sahelian region of West Africa. So next slide. What we can do with this material and what not. I don't think it offers, this kind of evidence doesn't offer insight into the motivation behind crimes. People don't leave evidence of that so much in the digital record. It's absent of political and historical context. We don't really understand from seeing fragments from a cluster bomb what motivated that cluster bomb, what motivated the people who had it dropped. And then there are the issues that I'm not as sure about and that I'm looking into. Does it offer insight into new forms of identity and networking? Will people really form a community around these kinds of archiving efforts? Does it reach broad public audiences directly without journalistic filters? Some of it is technical and complex, and it's written in a way and has to be written in a way for it to be reliable. In articles by Bellingcat and by Mnemonic and others, that you have to have some technical knowledge and be able to follow the steps in order to really get the benefit. And there have been some who've just done these fake articles that really aren't based on anything at all, and you have to be able to tell the difference. And can it overcome structures of impunity in international criminal law? This is the legal question. Will there be such a mass of evidence and such a public reliance on this mass and support of this mass of evidence as we have with Syrian archive, that it will create conditions in which it pushes the international community towards recognizing some states as being criminal actors? So next slide. We'll leave it there. Of course, with a few ways to get in touch with me. And I'm now open to your questions, and I hope you have some.
Thank you very
continue
much.
This discussion.
Brilliant, excellent, thank you. Let me try and unshare this if I can remember how to. Oh, how do I unshare?
You just go.
Yeah. Is that all right, everybody? Can you now see him?
Yep.
Are you still seeing?
Still seeing, thank you.
Oh no. Help. This is where.
David, go to the arrow, like when you
Yes.
started sharing, and just click on that arrow, and it's gonna change, and then it will stop. It'll ask you to stop sharing. You'll say yes. So all the way to your neck, when you see leave, there is an arrow there that you've like clicked on the first time. Click on it again, and then it will ask you if you want to stop sharing.
David, on my screen, it's at the top next to the microphone, but it might be.
Yeah,
So microphone still leave, yeah, but they're all there, yeah.
For some reason, it just wants me to pick something else to share. Oh, what? Okay, let's try this. How about?
There we
what's
go.
that?
Looks promising.
Is that better?
That's an improvement. We have you, but we don't have your video.
Ooh. What's going on? What is going on? Sorry. How about that?
There we go.
That looks good.
Yeah, we have me with about a 5-second delay.
It's all very meta now.
Am I sharing ourselves?
We're still sharing.
We're recording this recording of a recording of a recording.
Oh, okay. But what? That should be better now. I finally had an option to stop sharing.
That's it.
There we
You've done
go.
it.
Cool. Cool. Okay. Let me start with a pessimistic parallel. One of the things that I regularly do in these seminars is say that there's nothing new under the sun, and digital makes some differences, but there are a lot of older parallels that digital people tend to ignore. So right at the end of your talk, I started thinking about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a well-known 19th century anti-Semitic fake, which was exposed as a fake late in the 19th century, and it didn't really stop many pogroms, and of course had no effect on Nazi Germany. So, I mean, this is a deeply pessimistic thought, but I don't know. I mean, all I suppose I'm saying is that issues of fakery have been around for a long time,
right?
And there are tools that can address them, and whether it actually works are not to do with the tools. Right.
So the idea of the history of these kinds of tools. First of all, that's right. And open source intelligence actually traces back to the World War I period, when the groups were actively perusing newspapers of the opposing sides, the public newspapers, because there was a lot of information that was being dropped in those journals, and there was a naivete about state secrets and secrets of war. So that was one of the early iterations of open source intelligence or open source investigations. And of course, this information goes all the way back. Probably Jack Goody could give us some insight into that. Because when you have critical thinking, you also have the tools of interrupting that thinking and offering falsehoods. And I would have been delighted to talk to him about that aspect of it. But what we have here in the Bellingcat toolkit, and what makes me think of Human Rights 3.0 as something quite different, is the range and extent of tools that can be amassed in a way that uses the scientific method of putting together claims about the occurrence of an event through the digital evidence, first of all, by authenticating the digital evidence, and then systematically tracing it to a particular place and at times particular individuals, to the point that one can result in an indictment by the International Criminal Court or by other courts that see this as sufficiently reliable to use their powers to issue indictments, and in the case of Al-Mahdi, a criminal finding. The evidence was so overwhelming in his case that he undertook a plea bargain. It never was tested through cross-examination. So my sense is that both, taking your point, that what makes things different now, and I don't want to be completely optimistic about this. I actually share some of your pessimism. But what we have now is an acceleration or ramping up of the stakes and of the technological sophistication of the tools being used in what I refer to in #HumanRights as a digital arms race, right? It's a digital arms race in several senses. It's a digital arms race between states I've actually heard somebody argue that we're actually in the middle of World War III right now. And certainly we're in the middle of another Cold War right now. We're in the middle of Cold War II, I would argue. And this is a Cold War that's being waged not through the kind of espionage games of Jean Le Carré from that Cold War era, but through sophisticated development of these technological tools and capacities to penetrate one's, ability, other states. So that's one way that it's taking place. But it's also taking place through a contests between dissidents and states against which they're mobilizing. So the states are bringing to bear tools of, again, espionage, hacking, and dissidents are bringing to bear tools of digital forensics and exposure, and bringing their investigations out into the light of day by bypassing journalistic filters. That's where it is.
Thank you, Hugh.
In a nutshell.
Thomas, you've got your hand raised.
Yes, hi. Yeah, I guess just sort of, in a way, extending David's question and some other points that you raised. One of the things that I was thinking as you were presenting is, as the title of your book kind of suggests, I guess the bulk of the presentation, at least, was kind of on evidentiary witnessing, the kind of feasibility of validating the fact claims of things within archives and so on, but it's basically truth claims and this sort of appeal to reason and so on. And I'm just thinking, and I don't have any particular kind of focus in mind, in what way am I posing this question, but what about archives that make less or no appeal to that kind of truth claim? They're simply about an appeal to emotion and a provocation and a really sensational and gory and horrifying and provocative kind of image-based, let's call it witness, but more just sort of statement with no discernible, and it's just an aggravation in a certain way. And there are certain archives that exist, and it's sort of what artists play with all the time. So I was wondering kind of if that features within your book, or kind of how you account for those bits and pieces, those elements of media that aren't necessarily about fact.
Right. I actually have my book here, and one of the ways that I encountered this was in the presentations that were made by the Herero genocide groups, who really focus on the gruesome imagery of the German genocide and war against the Herero and Nama in 1904 to 1908 in German Southwest Africa. And the images are just like completely revolting with, I don't want to get into describing them. But they take this as a matter of fact. They print them on T-shirts in their annual gatherings. It's become almost a part of their collective identity as victims, as descendants of the survivors of the genocide. So we have that, and we even have elements of that in Syrian archive, which has an element inclining towards legal forensics. So you have images in Syrian archives of infants, children choking from being gassed with sarin gas and lying on a table, and things that sort of viscerally grab the emotions. And this is a part of the idea of making justice claims to publics. So it's both a forensically verifiable claim of a war crime, but also the kind of thing that you're pointing to, an element of outreach to a public audience that is oriented towards grabbing their sympathies. And it does this with an emphasis on what's sometimes referred to as perfect victims. The children and the elderly, people who would have no stake in the war and no ability to fight it, right? So there's an element of innocence. It's already making a claim about the kind of victim, so that the depiction of that person's suffering or those people's suffering is in itself an appeal to the way that we understand and nurture, and an appeal to our sympathies. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, I can't see any more hands raised, so I will follow on from that.
We have Jonas Zabluski.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm gonna just say one little thing before Jonas, which is something I think we need to be careful about what we call an archive. I mean, I don't want to get all too definitional, but there are things which do make archives different, whether they're digital or not. I mean, so it's things like, I know because we actually had a paper to this seminar 3 or 4 years ago about the early days of the Syrian archive. They were posting stuff on YouTube, which were then being taken down because they were seen as YouTube said, well, this is glorifying terrorism. And that's why they had to create their own server space.
Okay.
Right. And so it's not, you can't, there is a difference between, as it were, the Internet Archive and YouTube.
Right. Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that Syrian Archive did probably since that event was, for a number of reasons, they went to the Holocaust Museum in the Netherlands and got advice about how best to preserve their material. And interestingly enough, the recommendation was to get the material offline and get it onto magnetic tape, which will last about 25, 30 years. So it's like the reel-to-reels that used to be, the old-fashioned way of the best music recordings were on these reel-to-reels. And the thing about the magnetic tape that's stored offline is it's not hackable. Like you don't have access to it. So it's carefully and secretly stored in a way that states won't be able to gain access to it, no matter how many resources they pour into it. And so in that case, what we have is very clearly an archive that is using the technologies and knowledge of archivists, professional archivists. But the internet, I don't, by itself, like YouTube, these platforms, I don't consider an archive because they are they're both permanent and impermanent, let's put it that way. Like we're not able to erase our presence on the internet, nor can we control where it goes. So there isn't an ability to securely like nail down the data, even though it's there. So it's sort of there and evanescent and mobile and shifting at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole seminar about this. I won't, a whole conversation. I won't get on that hobby horse. That would be to abuse my position as chair. Jonas.
I mean, David, I'm not sure if you guys can see me. I sort of like had a similar question, so I should have probably gone a bit before you. But one of the things that I'm also thinking about when it comes to the archive, well, first of all, thank you so much. This is fascinating, and I find it very illuminating. And thanks for the work that you do. But also when I'm thinking about the archive as well, I was not like what David mentioned earlier, but I'm also thinking of what to be archived, meaning the selection criteria and sort of the management of an archive, what things that would be, what are some of the selection criteria for something to be really archived and not archived, and how that's sort of being managed. And then this brings me to another question, or probably like a comment, and I'd like to hear a little bit from you, is about authenticity or the authentication. And I'm thinking about this sort of process, on like on what grounds are things, how do you go about the authenticity or authenticate? And I say that because I'm thinking of, for instance, I'll give you just an example. I'm thinking about the Assad regime, and I'm thinking of what happens, including the chemical weapons, where of course from the regime, they would always deny that all that stuff is fakery. And it's you've mentioned the Ghouta as well, and there were things that was written, of course, by loyalists to the Alawis and to the Assad, where they're literally saying, okay, there is sort of an archive, but all of it is fakery, and people who are actually with other, and the thing with Assad is always like accusing international players. They are making this stuff, they are putting this stuff there. So I really ask you general these questions: how do you go about authenticity? How do you authenticate? How do you speak back sort of the regime? But also when you mentioned all parties as well in one of your slides, and I absolutely agree with you, it's not only about the Assad regime, but also insurgencies, but also Turkey, but also Russia, but even at some states, United States as well, the killing of certain civilians as well. And that could be, that's a valid point. And one other thing that I'm also thinking about, which I found very fascinating, you've spoken about the dynamics, and the dynamics are that you have someone who's on ground taking a picture or a video. Do you have sort of an analyst, like somebody like analyst and an analyst, but you also have journalists, and this goes through very like sort of dynamics, and you might have to work on that video a bit before it's archived. But also I want to ask you, don't you also see a shift? And this is something that happened also in the Syrian archive, where at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, you had a lot of materials because people were still there, because you have over 6 million that were sort of left displaced, but you have also internal displacement. Then it gives you where at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, even you talk about the children, which is actually true. You had them there. I read some poetry. Actually, we have children actually like literally on pavements, on the grounds, and they're choking and all that. And there are a lot of very disturbing like videos and all that. But I'm jumping a little bit, sort of like the last 2 years where you don't really have much. One, because of the censorship on Facebook and WhatsApp, you mentioned that like there is like a crack on that, and there's also like a banning of Facebook and WhatsApp that has been for a while. Right. But the second thing, also think about it, that they're in Syria for the last few years. You can't be able to have this sort of analyst or even journalist on ground. There's no one is allowed actually to go in. So I'm also like thinking of this shift, and I really mentioned this where you had a lot of stuff being there, where it's really hard now to get most of the data. And the data that probably a lot of archives had is also like Syrians in the diaspora, which is a lot in Europe, because they have all this stuff or they received it from their family. But I really find this fascinating. So I just want to hear a little bit about, and I'm sorry, I'm saying a lot of things, but thank you.
No, this is great. This is really interesting. I'm interested. I suspected as much, but you really added some clarity to the situation. One in which there is, of course, much less material that's coming up. There are a number of reasons for this. What is the crackdown by the social media giants in terms of content? So they've upped their content moderation. So when I first started doing this, it was really easy to find material online that you wish you didn't see, right? Stuff that like starts affecting your dreams at night. But now it's taken away almost immediately. And one of the problems that I'm looking at is the responsibility that digital social media platforms have to archive their own the material evidence of crimes that they find online. They just remove it and throw it away. I say it's a little bit like, a hotel. If you find somebody murdered in a hotel, you get rid of the body because you don't want to bother the next guest, right? And so what they really need to be doing when they find clear evidence of criminal activity without verifying it or anything, going through any of the steps, is just to keep it in an offline archive. And they need to take that step to facilitate the kind of investigations that we're looking at. So one of the things that that might interest you that Syrian archive is doing in the process of authentication is they're using machine learning algorithms to sift through their some 4 million items to look for particular things. So they trained, for example, the algorithm to look for cluster bombs. So it's a very simple program. Cluster bomb, not cluster bomb. Cluster bomb fragment, not cluster bomb fragment. And one of the things that they're very proud of, that they see as being part of the incontrovertible nature of the evidence that's amassed in the archive, is the sheer number of items that they have that get picked out by machine learning algorithms. There's so much of it that they can't do it themselves through human analysts, simply because the time it would take to go through the millions of items to look for these little bits of evidence is like years, you know. Now about the disinformation, I agree with your pessimism and with David's pessimism that there is really nothing that can be done about the denials and deflections and disinformation and strategic disinformation, right? It's oriented towards confusing the knowledge environment. And this is something that's important for us to consider when we look at the problem of knowledge, which is actually very central to the anthropological project. Where knowledge is systemically made uncertain, strategically made uncertain, we have a different kind of political contest that's based upon, it has as its axis the believability of the evidence that's being brought to bear of state responsibility against the confusion, muddying the waters effect of the organized and systemic denial. So I don't have an answer for where this leaves us. Where the only answer is it leaves us in this condition of contest and uncertainty. And that's where I have to leave it, because there is no solution to it that I know. But on the other hand, it isn't preventing, from the legal point of view, it isn't preventing legal answerability for the crimes of the state that makes use of the digital visual evidence in a critical way. So courts are able to sift through the evidence in a way that the public isn't. The public can be distracted and diverted and fooled and drawn into conspiracy theories quite readily. But the same doesn't happen in courts, right? Because they're accustomed to it. They're accustomed to doubting knowledge and prodding and poking at it. And what's interesting about that aspect of it is that this kind of evidence has never yet been tested in an international court. It's not been subjected to cross-examination. Al-Mahdi was a plea bargain. It wasn't, he didn't allow the defense the opportunity to challenge the data. And what's one of the reasons that I showed you the material from Parler was hoping that this might come up, actually. So for the January 6th rioters, it's actually these prosecutions in the United States that are going to really be the first broad test of digital visual evidence that will then in turn set legal standards for international criminal law.
Okay, thank you. Bill.
Yes, thank you very much for a really thought-provoking talk. My question, I think, is a variation on the theme of questions people have already asked. And what I'm thinking about, and this relates to two cases that I'm aware of, one a student project and another one related to my area of interest, which is Japan. And it has to do more with kind of amateur crowdsourcing of information. The first case I'm thinking of is Fukushima in Japan, the nuclear disaster, and the area around the nuclear plant that was contaminated. And in that case, something quite interesting happened in that people who doubted the government's reports on the level of radiation in different areas started to crowdsource, buy their own Geiger counters, take readings, gather this information together, and create a detailed map of different radiation readings crowdsourced by people on the ground. And this became more reliable. I mean, this was seen as being more reliable than anything the government was producing. So my question is kind of around reliability. The other case, and this is a student project that just recently, which had to do with crowdsourcing information related to a disaster. In this case, it was fires burning in California. And it was the same idea that amateurs, sort of modern day ham radio operators, if you like, were tracking, picking up sources from Twitter and other social media, and amalgamating all this information, and then producing not exactly a map, but some sort of something like a map of information, and that archive, if you like, amateur produced archive, became more important, the most important way of tracking the fire, more important than anything that legitimate authorities were producing. And interestingly, he also linked this to the collapse of local media, which is another, it's another aspect of the story, that the mass media has changed a lot and is changing, and they were becoming less effective on the ground. And so this was, in a way, filling a void or a vacuum that was, and anyway, again, the issue is the same. It's reliability of information partly. And I'm just wondering if you saw, and again, it's a variation of the same question, but I mean, is there, going forward, are there the possibilities of introducing regimes for production of information so that if you want to participate in crowdsourcing, it has to be done in a certain way? I'm thinking a process, and also related to your talk, more specifically, reliability of information for purposes in legal trials and things of that sort. But the fact that amateur produced crowdsourcing information is now being seen as the most reliable in some instances, I think is interesting. Yeah,
that is that's really that's an interesting question. I'm apologizing because somebody's just started using a weed whacker right outside my building. I don't think you can hear it. There we go. So crowds. Crowds are amazing from the point of view of legal questions, because you can't put a crowd on the stand. You can't get somebody to tell you where the crowd came up with X, Y, and Z result. And yet investigators are making use of crowds all the time. So Bellingcat, for example, in its investigations, when it needs to geolocate something and their investigators don't have a clue, will go to the crowd. It's how they identified the location of the mass killings that Alwar Fali undertook in Libya, which were identified as being outside of a Chinese construction project near Benghazi. And it's somebody who'd lived there before, looked at the color of the sand, the buildings, and so on, said, I know where this is. Europol is using the crowd when it is looking for evidence of child abduction and child harm. And they'll put it out there. And sometimes people who have absolutely no idea what they're doing will come up with a result. There's one, they had one question that came out of China, and a person approached it by going up and down the streets of every coastal city in China and miraculously found the location just by using Google Earth Street View and happening to come across the thing. When you have many thousands of people working on a problem, that result becomes possible. That it would be foolish to do that as an individual and with limited resources. So crowds are becoming reliable. But again, I want to introduce a note of, let's pursue this. I want to introduce a note of pessimism. Because the QAnon phenomenon is another way that crowds work, right? Somebody will come up with a take on a conspiracy, like, yes, I think such and such. And so it must have this connection to X, Y, and Z, and it's all a fantasy, but it appeals to other people's fantasies, and then it becomes knowledge by virtue of its appeal to their sort of prurient interest in a question or what they want the truth to be, right? So it's a mass appeal that is making use of people's creativity, that's oriented towards deepening, furthering a conspiracy theory that has no basis in fact, and that is suspicious of facts. So this is where the difference between the crowd that's oriented towards and committed to an investigation has to really do its work. There has to be a common commitment to certain fundamentals that have to do with the reliability of the information to begin with, and what is an acceptable fact and what isn't. And when you have that, then things can produce the sorts of results you described for Fukushima and the fires.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed your talk.
Thanks.
Okay. Do we have any? We've got time for one more question, perhaps, or I don't see any more hands. So perhaps we should wrap it up. So Ronald, thank you so much. That was excellent. I'm sorry we had quite a small live audience, but we do have the recording which we will be distributing. So I hope you'll be getting feedback in the next week or so.
Sure. If anyone wants to write me, send me an email. I'd be happy to engage in a conversation.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks again, and yeah, we'll be in touch. I've got a couple of things I'm going to send you myself, and yeah, one day we will do this. What is traditional at this point is that we all go to the pub.
Oh, well, I'm afraid it's a little early for. It's a little early. It's like nearly 9 o'clock in the morning. A little early for a pint, but I'll raise one in your honor tonight, I promise.
Well, yeah, we owe you. Thank you so much. And yeah, one day we'll do this in person.
Great,
David,
wonderful.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Did you want me to say anything about what's forthcoming for the rest of the term?
Please, yes, because I forgot.
Okay, I think I've got it here. Just one.